There is something about trees that nobody ever really stops to think about. I mean, we all know where trees come from, of course we do. You bury a seed in the ground, you give it some water, you wait, and eventually something green pushes up through the dirt and reaches toward the sky. Trees come from the ground. Kids know this. It seems almost embarrassingly obvious, not even worth asking about. But here on Feynman's path, we think that is exactly where the most dangerous assumptions hide. Right there in the things that feel too obvious to question. Because there is a question lurking inside this everyday miracle that almost nobody has ever seriously asked. And when you actually sit down and chase it, when you refuse to let the comfortable, intuitive answer slide by unchallenged, the answer you eventually find is so strange, so completely at odds with everything your gut tells you about how the physical world works, that it will permanently change the way you look at every single tree you ever walk past for the rest of your life. I am not being dramatic. I want you to hold me to that. So let us start with the most obvious version of the question. Imagine a fully grown oak tree, a big one, the kind that has been standing in someone's backyard for 100 years. That tree weighs somewhere around 10 or 11,000 pounds. Some trees weigh considerably more than that. 100 years ago, that entire mass simply did not exist. There was no wood, no bark, no roots, no branches, just a small acorn sitting in the dirt. So here is the question, and I want you to take it seriously for a moment before you answer it. Where did all of that mass come from? Not in a vague, hand-wavy sense. Not in a schoolbook sense where we just nod along and move on. I mean physically, materially, in terms of actual atoms and molecules and pounds and kilograms. Where did the stuff that makes up that 10,000-pound tree actually come from? The most natural answer, the one that leaps immediately to almost everyone's mind, is the soil. The roots go deep, they pull up nutrients. The tree drinks from the earth, and somehow all of that becomes wood. That is the picture most of us carry around, and it feels completely right, it feels obvious, it feels settled. Except it is wrong. And the way we know it is wrong goes back to a man who lived 400 years ago in Flanders, a region that is now part of Belgium. His name was Jan Baptist van Helmont, and in the early 1600s he performed what is, in hindsight, one of the most elegant and unsettling experiments in the history of science. Van Helmont took a young willow tree that weighed about 5 pounds. He planted it in a pot containing 200 pounds of dried soil, and then he just waited for 5 years. He watered the tree, he protected it, he let it grow. Nothing else was added to the pot except rainwater and well water. No extra soil, no fertilizer, nothing. 5 years later, he dug everything up and weighed it. The willow tree now weighed nearly 170 pounds. It had added more than 164 pounds of new mass, from a 5-pound seedling to something approaching 170 pounds. Then he dried out all the soil in the pot and weighed it again. 200 pounds of soil at the start. After 5 years of feeding a tree that had gained over 164 pounds, the soil had lost about 2 ounces, not 2 pounds. 2 ounces. Let that land for a moment. A tree gained 164 pounds. The soil it was growing in lost about 2 ounces. The math does not work. The numbers do not balance. If the tree was getting its mass from the soil should have gotten dramatically lighter. Instead, it was essentially unchanged. Van Helmont himself concluded from this experiment that the mass must have come from the water. He was wrong about that too, as it turns out, but you cannot fault the logic. He looked at his data, he eliminated soil, and he pointed at the only other thing going into that pot. Now here is where things start to get genuinely uncomfortable. Because if you follow this problem honestly, you realize you are standing in front of a 10,000-pound object, watching it grow in front of you over decades, and you cannot actually explain where the physical mass is coming from. Soil? The numbers say no. Water? We will get to why that does not work either. What is left? What is left that a tree actually has access to? This is the moment where most people shrug and decide there must be some complicated chemistry involved, some technical process that scientists understand, and they file it away and move on with their day. And I understand that impulse completely. Not every mystery demands your attention. But I want to make a case that this one does. Because the answer to where a tree's mass comes from is not just a botanical fact. It is a direct window into one of the most philosophically disorienting truths in all of physics. The answer reveals something about the nature of matter itself, about the relationship between energy and substance that our everyday intuitions are completely and systematically wrong about. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So let us be honest about water first, because it is the next candidate and it seems promising. Trees drink enormous quantities of water. On a hot summer day, a large oak might move nearly 100 gallons of water from its roots to its leaves. Over a century, the total volume of water passing through a single tree is almost incomprehensible. Surely you might think, some of that enormous volume of water must become the tree? Here is the problem. Water is H2O. Two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. When a tree processes water, it breaks that molecule apart. It takes the hydrogen atoms, which it will use in chemical reactions, and it releases the oxygen back into the atmosphere. That oxygen released into the air from water, combined with the oxygen that comes off from carbon dioxide, is essentially where the oxygen we breathe comes from. But even setting that aside, hydrogen is the lightest element in the entire universe. To build a 10,000-pound tree out of hydrogen alone would require truly staggering quantities of it. And more fundamentally, trees are not made of hydrogen. Wood is not hydrogen. If you analyze what wood actually is at the molecular level, you find something very different. Wood is mostly carbon. Carbon is the structural backbone of essentially every organic molecule that makes up living things on Earth. It is heavy. It is dense, it forms incredibly strong chemical bonds, and it makes up roughly half of the dry weight of any tree you have ever touched. Roughly half of that 10,000-pound oak is carbon. But here is the crisis. Soil does not have nearly enough carbon to account for it. Water has 0 carbon. So where in the world is all of this carbon coming from? This is the point where the experiment catches up with intuition, and intuition completely collapses. The carbon has to come from somewhere. Conservation of mass is not optional. You cannot get something from nothing. Every single carbon atom in that tree existed somewhere else before the tree incorporated it. The question is where? And when you have ruled out the ground, and you have ruled out the water, and you look around at what else a tree actually has access to, there is really only one thing left: air. The answer is air. Not as a metaphor. Not poetically. The 10,000-pound oak tree in your neighbor's yard is, in the most literal, physical, molecular sense possible, solidified air. Take a moment with that, because I know it sounds wrong. It sounds like the kind of thing someone says to sound profound, but that does not actually hold up. So let me be very precise about the mechanism, because the precision is where the wonder lives. The atmosphere contains carbon dioxide. At this moment, carbon dioxide makes up roughly 0.04% of the air around you. It is an almost comically small fraction of what you are breathing right now. And yet this nearly invisible trace gas is, quite literally, the primary raw material that plants use to build their entire physical structure. Here is how it works. A leaf has millions of tiny pores on its surface called stomata. These stomata open and close, and when they are open, carbon dioxide molecules drift in from the surrounding air. The leaf then does something remarkable. Using energy captured from sunlight, it breaks those carbon dioxide molecules apart. It seizes the carbon atoms, which are the heavy ones, the structurally important ones, and it releases the oxygen back out into the atmosphere. Those captured carbon atoms are then used to build sugars. Simple sugars at first, like glucose, which is just a chain of 6 carbon atoms with some hydrogen and oxygen attached. But then the plant chains those sugars together into longer and longer molecules, stacking them, cross-linking them, weaving them into the cellulose and lignin that give wood its strength and density, and the particular solid weight that you feel when you pick up a piece of lumber. Every cell wall in that tree, every fiber of wood, every root tip, every branch, all of it built from carbon atoms that, not so long ago, were drifting through the atmosphere as invisible gas. This is not a simplification. This is not me skipping over the complicated parts. This is the actual mechanism, stated as precisely as it can be stated. Trees pull carbon out of the air and pack it into solid matter. Van Helmont sat there after his experiment, bewildered, unable to explain where the mass had gone, and the answer was floating right in front of his face the entire time. It was in the air of his laboratory. It was in the air above his garden. He just had no framework to see it, because nobody at that time had any reason to think of air as a substance that could have mass, let alone a substance that could be captured and converted into something you could saw in half and build a house out of. Now, I want to pause here for just a second, because this is the moment in a lot of science explanations where someone waves their hands and says photosynthesis, and everyone nods, and we all move on as if the word itself is an explanation. It is not. The word is just a label we attach to a process. And the process itself, when you actually look at what is happening at the level of molecules and energy, is one of the most physically profound things that occurs anywhere in the known universe. Richard Feynman, the physicist whose spirit we try to honor on this channel, used to say that you do not understand something until you can explain it simply enough that your grandmother can follow along. He was not being condescending, he was pointing at something real. The ability to strip a process down to its essential mechanism without hiding behind jargon is the only honest test of whether you actually understand it. So let us try to actually understand photosynthesis, not just name it. Here is what is happening inside a leaf when sunlight hits it. Sunlight is not just light in the sense of a thing you can see, it is electromagnetic radiation. It is a wave of electric and magnetic fields propagating through space at roughly 670 million miles per hour. And within the cells of that leaf, there are molecules called chlorophyll that are specifically shaped to interact with certain wavelengths of that electromagnetic radiation. When a photon, a single packet of light energy, collides with a chlorophyll molecule, something happens that is, when you think about it carefully, almost magical. The energy from that photon is absorbed by an electron inside the chlorophyll molecule. That electron gets excited. It jumps to a higher energy state, and in that excited state, it becomes something remarkable. It becomes a carrier. That energized electron then moves through a chain of molecular structures inside the cell, something called the electron transport chain, passing its energy along almost like a relay baton being handed from runner to runner. At each step, the energy being transferred is used to drive a chemical reaction. Specifically, it is used to pump hydrogen ions across a membrane, building up a kind of chemical pressure, which is then used to power a molecular machine called ATP synthase, which spins, literally physically rotates, to manufacture a molecule called ATP. ATP is essentially the energy currency of all life. When a cell needs to do work, when a muscle needs to contract, when a nerve needs to fire, when a tree needs to build a new cell wall, it spends ATP. Photosynthesis is fundamentally a process of converting light energy into ATP and then using that ATP to power chemical construction. And here is where the carbon enters the story. With ATP in hand, the leaf cell now has enough energy to do something that carbon dioxide would never do on its own. Carbon dioxide is an extremely stable molecule. The carbon atom sits between two oxygen atoms, forming strong bonds, and the whole structure is very happy to just float around in the atmosphere essentially forever without reacting with anything. To break those bonds, to pry that carbon atom loose from its two oxygen partners, requires a significant input of energy. The leaf has that energy now. It uses it ruthlessly. In a series of reactions, collectively called the Calvin cycle, the cell grabs carbon dioxide molecules, breaks the bonds between carbon and oxygen, and uses the freed carbon atoms to build longer and longer molecular chains. The first stable organic molecule that results from this process is a 3-carbon compound called glyceraldehyde, 3-phosphate. Do not worry about the name. What matters is that this is the moment of transformation. This is the instant where something that was a gas becomes something that is not a gas. And from that 3-carbon foundation, the cell can build glucose. And from glucose, it can build sucrose to transport energy around the plant. And from those sugars, it can build cellulose, which is the primary structural material of plant cell walls. And from those cells, packed together and reinforced with another polymer called lignin, it can build wood. Hard, dense, solid, heavy wood that you can knock on with your knuckles and feel the resistance pushing back against your hand. All from air. All from those carbon atoms that were floating invisibly around the atmosphere, captured one by one, stripped of their oxygen companions, and locked into solid molecular chains by the energy of sunlight. This is Feynman's point about understanding, by the way. The word photosynthesis hides something. It makes a profound physical transformation sound routine, like a word on a vocabulary test. But when you follow the actual mechanism, when you trace the path from a photon of sunlight striking a leaf to a carbon atom being permanently incorporated into a wood fiber, you are watching something that violates every naive intuition we have about the relationship between matter and energy. Because what a tree is doing, at the most fundamental level, is using energy to create structure. It is converting a form of energy, electromagnetic radiation from the sun, into a form of matter, the organized chemical bonds of solid organic molecules. And those chemical bonds, those organized arrangements of electrons shared between carbon atoms, represent stored energy. Energy that, hundreds of millions of years ago, was stored in the carbon of ancient plants, and is now, in compressed and transformed form, what we call coal and oil and natural gas. When you burn wood in a fireplace, you are not just releasing heat. You are releasing the sunlight that fell on leaves, in some cases centuries ago. You are reversing the process. You are breaking those carbon-carbon bonds that the tree spent years building, and the energy that was trapped in those bonds is being released as heat and light. The fire you are watching is, in a real physical sense, ancient sunlight escaping. I want to give you a moment to sit with that, because it is the kind of thought that deserves more than a quick nod. The wood in a fireplace, the paper in a book, the cotton in the shirt you are wearing. All of these were once invisible gas, floating in the atmosphere. Electromagnetic radiation from a star 93 million miles away hit a leaf, excited an electron. That electron drove a chemical machine. That machine captured carbon from the air, and that carbon was assembled, atom by patient atom, into something solid enough to hold in your hands. Matter constructed from energy, substance assembled from radiation. The borderline between what we think of as stuff and what we think of as force turns out to be far more permeable than our intuitions suggest. This is, incidentally, one of Feynman's deepest contributions to our understanding of the universe. The theory of quantum electrodynamics, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1954, is fundamentally a theory about how light and matter interact. It is about how photons, the particles of electromagnetic radiation, interact with charged particles like electrons. And the extraordinary thing about quantum electrodynamics is that it reveals, at the deepest level we currently have access to, that matter and energy are not really two separate things. They are different expressions of the same underlying reality. That is an abstract statement, I know. But photosynthesis is what it looks like in practice. In a leaf, right now, sunlight is being converted into matter. Energy is becoming stuff. If that does not strike you as one of the most remarkable things you have ever heard, I suspect you have not fully let it land. Let me try a different angle, because I think the full strangeness of this has not quite hit yet. You are made of carbon. I mean that literally. Carbon forms the backbone of every protein in your muscles, every fat molecule in your brain, every strand of DNA in every one of your cells. The carbon in your body, by dry weight, accounts for somewhere around 18% of you. If you weighed 150 pounds, roughly 27 pounds of you is carbon. Where did that carbon come from? Well, you ate it. It came from your food. Maybe from meat, maybe from plants, maybe from both. But trace that food back to its origin, follow the chain far enough, and you will inevitably arrive at a plant. Because animals get their carbon by eating plants, or by eating animals that ate plants, or by eating animals that ate animals that ate plants. Every carbon atom in every living creature on Earth today was, at some point, pulled out of the atmosphere by a plant. Which means that the carbon in your muscles right now was, not that long ago by geological standards, floating in the air. Think about what that means for the question of where you came from. We have cultural stories about humans being made from clay, from earth, from dust. And there is something to that. There are minerals and trace elements in your body that do come from soil. But the primary stuff of you, the carbon backbone of your biochemistry, did not come from the ground. It came from the sky. It came from the air. It was captured by leaves and assembled into food and eaten and digested and incorporated into you. You are, in a precise molecular sense, a temporary arrangement of atmospheric gases. Gases that were organized and assembled into more and more complex structures by the energy of sunlight, passing through one living organism after another, until they ended up in their current configuration, sitting in a chair, listening to these words, and contemplating their own strangeness. That is not a metaphor. That is a description of the actual biochemistry. And here is where the deepening spiral really begins to pull downward. Because this fact about carbon, this fact about where the physical stuff of life actually comes from, opens onto a question that is considerably more vertiginous than the original puzzle about trees. If matter can be created from energy, if electromagnetic radiation can be converted into solid molecular structures, then what exactly is the difference between matter and energy? And if the answer to that question is less than we thought, what does that tell us about the nature of matter itself, about what solid objects actually are, about the desk you are sitting at, and the floor underneath your feet, and the atoms that make up your own hands right now? We are not done with the tree, not even close. The tree has more to teach us, but we have to go deeper first. There is a question that physicists have wrestled with for over a century, and it goes something like this. What is matter, actually? Not what does matter do, not how does matter behave. What is it? What is the desk made of, at the bottom, when you have divided it as finely as anything can be divided? The classical answer, the one that feels intuitive and satisfying, is that matter is stuff. Tiny, hard, indivisible little balls of stuff. Atoms. You cannot cut them any further. They are just solid. They are the bottom of the universe. Except that is not what physicists find when they actually look. In the early 20th century, a series of experiments forced a completely different picture of the atom onto the scientific community, and almost nobody who hears about it really stops to appreciate how strange it is. The atom, it turns out, is not a tiny solid ball. An atom is almost entirely empty space. Here is a way to feel the scale of this. If you took a hydrogen atom, which is the simplest atom there is, just one proton and one electron, and you blew it up until the nucleus was the size of a marble, the electron orbiting that nucleus would be roughly a mile away. The atom would be 2 miles across, and nearly all of that 2-mile sphere would be empty. Nothing in it, just space. And this is true of every atom in every object you have ever touched or stood on or run your hand across. The chair you are sitting in right now, the floor under your feet, the bones in your hand, all of it is, by volume, overwhelmingly empty space. So why does the chair feel solid? Why does it hold you up? This is where the electromagnetic force comes back into the story. The electrons in the atoms of your body carry a negative electric charge. The electrons in the atoms of the chair also carry a negative electric charge, and like charges repel. When you sit in the chair, what you experience as solidity, what you feel as the chair pushing back against you, is the electromagnetic repulsion between the electrons in your body and the electrons in the chair. You are not actually touching the chair, in the sense of one solid thing making contact with another solid thing. You are hovering on a cushion of electromagnetic force. Stop and consider that for a moment, if you would. The sensation of touching something, the most basic, immediate physical sensation we have access to, is not matter touching matter. It is a force field. The feeling of solid ground beneath your feet is electromagnetic repulsion all the way down. Feynman talked about this directly. He described the atom as consisting almost entirely of nothing, with a tiny, tiny nucleus at the center made of protons and neutrons, surrounded by what he called a cloud of electrons. Not a cloud in the soft, fluffy sense, a cloud of probability. Because at the quantum level the electron does not have a precise location. It exists as a kind of smear of probability distributed through space, more likely to be found in some places than others, but not definitely anywhere until you measure it. The solid, definite, located reality that our everyday experience tells us the world consists of is, at the quantum level, a statistical phenomenon. A blur of probabilities that resolves into specific outcomes when measured. The certainty we perceive is an emergent property of enormous numbers of these blurry, probabilistic quantum entities averaging out into behavior that is predictable and consistent at the scales we can directly observe. This is not philosophy. This is physics. It is what the equations say. It is what the experiments confirm. And it is currently the most accurate description of physical reality that human beings have been able to construct. Now, bring the tree back into the picture. The wood in that oak tree is made of carbon atoms bound together by electromagnetic force. Those carbon atoms were assembled from carbon dioxide gas by the energy of sunlight. That sunlight is electromagnetic radiation. And the bonds that hold the carbon atoms together in those long cellulose chains are themselves electromagnetic bonds, the result of electrons being shared between atoms, held in place by the same force that carried energy from the sun into the leaf. The tree is, at the deepest level we can currently describe it, a pattern of electromagnetic interaction. A stable, self-reinforcing organization of particles and forces that maintains itself by continuously capturing energy from the environment and using it to resist the tendency of things to fall apart. And now here is the thought I have been building toward for this entire conversation. You are the same thing. The molecules in your body are carbon compounds held together by electromagnetic bonds, just like the tree. The energy that maintains those bonds comes, ultimately, from food, which traces back to plants, which traces back to sunlight. You are, like the tree, a pattern of organized electromagnetic interaction, continuously consuming energy to maintain your structure against the second law of thermodynamics, which is always pushing toward disorder. The boundary between you and the tree is real in important ways. But it is a good deal more permeable at the fundamental level than it appears from the outside. Both of you are temporary arrangements of atoms that were once somewhere else and will eventually be somewhere else again. Both of you are running on captured sunlight. Both of you are, in the most physically precise sense available to us, structures of organized energy. The difference is the complexity and duration of the organization. Feynman once said something that I keep returning to whenever I think about this. He said that when you look at a flower, if you understand the biology and the chemistry and the physics of what is happening inside it, the flower does not become less beautiful. It becomes more beautiful, because now you have access to a level of wonder that is simply unavailable to someone who does not know what is actually happening. The beauty of the appearance does not go away, but it now has depth, it has layers. You can appreciate it in multiple dimensions at once. I think trees are like this. There is the surface level appreciation, which is real and valid. A big oak tree is majestic. The shade is pleasant. The sound of wind through the leaves is calming. None of that disappears when you understand what the tree actually is. But now you also know what the tree actually is. It is a machine for capturing electromagnetic radiation from a star and using that energy to extract carbon atoms from the atmosphere and arrange them into complex organic molecules and assemble those molecules into cells and stack those cells into a structure that can stand in place for 500 years. It is doing this right now. Every leaf on that tree, every single one, has millions of chlorophyll molecules actively capturing photons, exciting electrons, manufacturing ATP, breaking carbon dioxide, and building new molecular structures. The tree is not sitting still. At the molecular level, it is an astonishing scene of activity. Every cell, a tiny biochemical factory running continuously. And the products of that factory, those solid wood fibers, those carbon-carbon bonds, represent the accumulated work of centuries of sunlight. Every ring inside a tree trunk is a year of captured sunlight, packed into dense organic matter. When you count the rings on a felled tree, you are looking at a physical record of every growing season for however long that tree was alive, the sunlight of 300 springs preserved in wood. Now, I want to go one more layer down, because we have been circling something important, and I think it is time to say it directly. The question of where a tree's mass comes from is, when you follow it to its bottom, a question about the nature of matter and energy. And the answer that physics gives us is not the answer that our intuitions expect. Our intuitions say that matter is the fundamental thing, that stuff is primary, that energy is what matter does, not what matter is. Physics says something more interesting. Physics says that the distinction between matter and energy is a matter of perspective. E equals mc squared is the most famous equation in history, and what it says is that mass and energy are the same thing, expressed in different forms. Mass is, in a deep sense, a property of energy. The reason a rock is heavy is that it contains organized energy, energy stored in the chemical bonds and nuclear forces holding its atoms together. When a tree builds wood from atmospheric carbon dioxide, it is not creating matter out of nothing. It is converting the energy of sunlight into organized molecular structure, and that organized structure has mass, because organized energy has mass. The mass of the tree is the mass of the sunlight that built it, stored in the bonds between carbon atoms. This is not an approximation, this is not a metaphor, this is what the equations say. Mass is a manifestation of energy. Van Helmont's great puzzle, the puzzle of where the tree's mass was coming from, had an answer that he could not have imagined, not because he was not smart enough, but because the conceptual framework required to understand the answer did not exist yet. The answer required understanding that air has mass, that carbon dioxide is a substance, that electromagnetic radiation can be converted into solid matter. And at the deepest level, that matter and energy are not two different things, but two different aspects of the same underlying reality. He was not missing a fact. He was missing an entire worldview. And I think about that when I consider what else might be sitting right in front of us, right now, that we cannot see because our conceptual framework is not yet rich enough to perceive it. What are the Van Helmont moments of the 21st century? What are the things that seem obvious and settled that contain, hiding inside them, a revolution in understanding waiting to be uncovered by someone who refuses to take the obvious answer and move on? That is the spirit we are after here. That is the spirit Feynman embodied, the refusal to be satisfied by labels. The insistence on following a question past the comfortable stopping point, into the territory where things get strange, where intuitions fail, where the universe turns out to be so much more interesting than it first appeared. Let me bring up something that has been lurking underneath this entire conversation, something I have been deliberately holding back until now because I wanted the earlier pieces to settle first. We have been talking about where the carbon in a tree comes from. We have been talking about photosynthesis and electromagnetic bonds and the cycling of carbon through the biosphere. All of that is true and real and, I hope, has changed something in how you see the living world around you. But there is another version of the question, a much older, much deeper version, and it goes like this. Where did the carbon come from in the first place? Not where did the carbon go before it ended up in the tree, but where did carbon itself come from? Where did the element, the specific type of atom with 6 protons in its nucleus, come from? Because carbon did not exist at the beginning of the universe. The Big Bang produced hydrogen and helium and trace amounts of lithium, and essentially nothing else. The periodic table was almost empty. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, iron, silicon, every element heavier than lithium, all of them had to be created later. And the place where they were created is a place that should genuinely change how you feel about the matter your body is made of. They were made in stars. This is something Carl Sagan made famous with his phrase about being made of star stuff, and because it became famous, it has also become a little bit deadened by repetition. We say it, we nod, we feel vaguely moved, and then we go back to our lives without really sitting with what it means. So, I want to try to make it feel real. A star is, at its core, a nuclear fusion reactor. Hydrogen atoms, stripped of their electrons, are being compressed by the star's own gravity to such an extreme degree that they fuse. 2 hydrogen nuclei collide and combine to form helium. The helium nuclei then fuse to form beryllium. The beryllium fuses to form carbon. The carbon fuses to form oxygen, neon, magnesium, silicon, and so on, up the periodic table all the way to iron. At each step, fusion releases energy. That is where starlight comes from. The sun is literally losing mass as it shines, because the fusion of hydrogen into helium releases energy according to E=mc², and that energy is what comes streaming across 93 million miles of space and hits the leaves on the trees outside your window. For most of the elements that make up your body, this process happened inside stars that are no longer around. Stars that formed billions of years ago from the diffuse clouds of hydrogen and helium left over from the Big Bang, burned for millions of years, fused progressively heavier elements in their cores, and then, when they ran out of fuel, collapsed under their own gravity and exploded. That explosion is called a supernova, and it is one of the most energetic events that occurs in the universe. In the moment of a supernova, a single star briefly outshines the entire galaxy it belongs to. Every galaxy in the observable universe. One star, for a few weeks, shining brighter than hundreds of billions of other stars combined. And in the violence of that explosion, elements heavier than iron are synthesized, and all of the elements that were built up over the star's lifetime are flung out into space. The carbon, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the calcium and iron and phosphorus that your body needs, all of it scattered across the galaxy in an expanding shell of superheated gas. Eventually, over millions of years, that gas cloud drifts and cools and begins to condense under gravity. New stars form from it. New planetary systems form around those stars. And on some of those planets, under the right conditions, the chemistry of carbon gets complex enough to produce the thing we call life. The carbon in your body was made inside a star that exploded before our sun existed. The calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the phosphorus in your DNA, all of it was forged in stellar fusion reactions billions of years ago, scattered by a stellar explosion, drifted through space, coalesced into our solar system, was incorporated into the early Earth, cycled through the geology and the atmosphere and the ocean and the biosphere for billions of years, and has now ended up, temporarily, as you. Feynman talked about this too. About the way that physics reveals us to be not separate from the universe, but deeply, materially embedded in it. The same forces that hold stars together hold your cells together. The same electromagnetic interaction that makes sunlight also makes chemical bonds. The laws of physics that govern the behavior of matter in distant galaxies are the same laws that govern the behavior of the atoms in your brain right now. This is not a spiritual claim. It is a physical one. And the physical version is, I would argue, more astonishing than the spiritual version because it is specific and verifiable and rooted in mechanisms we actually understand. You are not made of stuff that is foreign to the cosmos. You are made of stuff that is absolutely native to it. You are a local expression of universal processes, the same things that make stars also make you. Gravity, electromagnetism, nuclear forces, the same fundamental interactions operating on the same fundamental particles. The tree in your backyard, when you trace its story all the way back, was made by the death of stars. The light that built it came from nuclear reactions 93 million miles away. The carbon atoms that form its structure were forged in stellar cores billions of years before the Earth existed. The electromagnetic bonds that hold those carbon atoms together are the same force that carries light across the universe. And you, standing next to that tree, are the same story told in a more complicated form. Van Helmont wondered where the tree's mass came from. The answer, when you trace it all the way back, is that it came from the nuclear furnaces of stars that lived and died billions of years ago, whose remains became our solar system, whose chemistry became our biosphere, whose light is still streaming down and building new wood every day in every tree and every forest on this planet. The question, where does a tree come from, turns out to be, if you follow it honestly and without settling for the comfortable answer, a question about the origin and nature of matter itself, about the history of the universe, about the relationship between energy and substance, about what you are and where you come from. That is not where I expected us to end up when we started talking about a willow tree in a pot of soil 400 years ago. But that is what happens when you refuse to let the obvious answer be enough. You keep pulling on the thread, and the thread turns out to be connected to everything. Let me tell you about a thought experiment that I think makes all of this viscerally real in a way that abstract physics cannot quite manage. Imagine you are standing in a forest. Let us put you in the Pacific Northwest, because the trees there are genuinely enormous. You are standing at the base of a Douglas fir that is maybe 250 feet tall and 12 feet in diameter. It weighs something like 400,000 pounds. You put your hand on the bark and feel the roughness of it, the deep furrowed texture of something that has been standing there for 800 years. 800 years ago, when that seed germinated, there was no United States. The Magna Carta had just been signed. Genghis Khan was beginning his conquests. 800 years of sun rose and set over that spot in the forest. 800 years of rain fell. 800 years of spring brought new leaves to the canopy. 800 years of summer drove the photosynthesis engines in those leaves. 800 years of autumn dropped those leaves to the forest floor. And during all of those 800 years, the tree was doing one thing above all else. It was breathing in carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen and incorporating the carbon, atom by atom, into its structure. The bark under your hand, the wood beneath the bark, the roots threading through 100 feet of soil. All of it was once in the air. Some of it might have been breathed out by animals that lived and died before any human being ever walked in that forest. Some of it might have been released by decomposing plants whose species no longer exist. The carbon atoms in that bark have been in and out of living things so many times, in so many forms, across such an incomprehensible span of time, that the concept of belonging to any particular organism starts to break down entirely. Carbon cycles. It does not stay anywhere for very long, in geological terms. An atom of carbon might spend a few decades in a tree, then get released when the tree burns or rots, then drift in the atmosphere for years, then get captured by another plant, incorporated into a leaf, eaten by an insect, eaten by a bird, deposited in soil when the bird dies, taken up by another tree, locked in wood for centuries, then released by fire, and the cycle continues. Some carbon atoms, the ones that end up at the bottom of the ocean, can stay locked away for millions of years before geological processes bring them back to the surface. Some end up incorporated into limestone, calcium carbonate, the compressed shells of billions of tiny marine organisms that lived and died over hundreds of millions of years, and sit now in the cliffs and mountains built from their remains. Your body contains carbon atoms that, in a previous life, helped build a dinosaur, or a trilobite, or an organism so ancient and strange that it has no common name and no living descendants. Your carbon has been everywhere. It will go everywhere again. This is, I think, the deepest level of the puzzle. Not just where a tree's mass comes from, but where any mass comes from, and where it is going, and what belonging to a particular body means when the atoms in that body are continuously cycling through the world, spending a few years here and a few years there, never resting, never settling, never truly belonging anywhere. Feynman had a beautiful way of talking about this. He was not given to mysticism or sentimentality, but he had a genuine sense of wonder about the physical world that came through in everything he wrote and said. He talked about how the scientific understanding of nature, far from diminishing its beauty, adds to it. Because now you have access to the beauty that is invisible, the beauty of the mechanism, the elegance of the process. There is something, he said, and I want to be careful here because I want to capture the spirit of it accurately without putting specific words in his mouth that he did not say. Feynman talked about how artists sometimes suggest that science takes the wonder out of a sunset, that by reducing the colors to the physics of light scattering in the atmosphere, something is lost. His response to this was essentially the opposite. He found that knowing the physics made the sunset more beautiful, not less. Because now when he saw the colors at the horizon, he was seeing not just the colors but the mechanism, the electromagnetic radiation at different wavelengths being scattered by different amounts by the atmosphere. The blue scattered away, leaving the red and orange of the low sun angle. He was seeing physics made visible, and that, he felt, was an additional source of beauty, not a subtraction from it. I want to suggest that the same thing is true of trees. When you walk through a forest now, knowing what you know from this conversation, you are not just walking among large plants. You are walking through a gallery of solidified sunlight. Every tree around you is a monument to photosynthesis, a centuries-long record of electromagnetic energy being converted into chemical bonds. The entire forest, every branch and root and leaf, is captured atmosphere, organized and structured by the patient work of biology over decades or centuries. And you, walking through that forest, are the same process in a more mobile form. Your body is built from the same carbon cycle, powered by the same solar energy, organized by the same electromagnetic forces. The only real difference between you and the tree is the time scale and the complexity of the organization. You are the universe becoming aware of itself for a moment. The carbon atoms that make up your brain were once in stars, were expelled in stellar explosions, drifted through space for billions of years, coalesced into a planet, cycled through the atmosphere and the ocean and the soil, and countless living organisms, and ended up, for this brief moment, arranged in a configuration capable of asking questions about where they came from. The tree cannot ask that question, but you can. And the fact that you can, the fact that this particular arrangement of ancient carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen has achieved the capacity for self-reflection and wonder is arguably the most remarkable thing in the entire story we have been telling. Here is something worth sitting with as we bring this particular thread to a close. Van Helmont's experiment was, in a sense, the perfect question. He stripped away all the assumptions, he designed a simple, rigorous test, and he let the data tell him what was true. He got the answer wrong, but he was using the exact right methodology, and the methodology eventually led, centuries later, to the correct answer. The reason it took so long is not that the people who came after Van Helmont were less intelligent. It is that the question required an entirely new conceptual vocabulary to answer. You had to understand that air is a substance with mass. You had to understand that plants can chemically transform gases. You had to understand the electromagnetic nature of chemical bonds. You had to understand that energy and matter are not completely distinct categories. Each of these understandings took generations to develop and was, at the time it was first proposed, deeply counterintuitive to everyone who heard it. This is how science actually works, not as a smooth accumulation of knowledge, but as a series of conceptual revolutions, each one requiring us to abandon something we thought we knew about the world and replace it with something that initially seems wrong, or absurd, or both, but that eventually reveals itself to be more true than what it replaced. And here is the question I want to leave you with. What is the Van Helmont puzzle of right now? What is the thing you currently believe about the world that feels so obvious, so settled, so not worth questioning, that the idea of it being wrong seems almost ridiculous? What is the question you have not asked yet, because the answer seems too obvious? Because history strongly suggests that somewhere in the vicinity of that question, there is a revolution waiting. The tree grew from air. The ground beneath it is mostly empty space. The solidity you feel when you knock on wood is a force field, not matter touching matter. The carbon in your bones was once in the atmosphere, was once in other creatures, will one day be in the atmosphere again. The energy that built you came from the sun. The sun is itself converting mass to energy at every moment, shining by the same relationship between matter and energy that explains why a tree has mass. All of this was hidden in plain sight. All of it was right there, inside the obvious fact that trees grow from the ground, waiting for someone to ask the question seriously. There are more questions like this. There are always more questions like this. And that, in the end, is the most Feynman-like thought I can leave you with. Not the specific answers we have covered today, fascinating as they are, but the habit of mind that generates them. The refusal to accept the comfortable answer. The insistence on actually understanding, rather than just knowing the name of the thing. The willingness to follow a question into strange and disorienting territory, trusting that the strangeness is a sign that you are getting closer to something real. That is the path we try to walk on this channel, and I am genuinely glad you are walking it with us. If today's journey into the secret life of trees sparked something for you, whether it is curiosity or confusion or that particular kind of wonder that feels like the world just got bigger, consider subscribing so you do not miss where we go next. Because we are going somewhere interesting. We always do. Thank you for your time and your attention. Both are genuinely precious. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.